Okay, so Brian Thom is joining us from the University of Victoria Ethnographic Mapping Lab. Brian and I have been working together for many, many years now, and he's always never afraid to try new things with our tools, which is one of the things that I appreciate about him. And he's going to tell you about how he's been using MyMaps in his project. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowan. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you all today. Thanks for coming out to the MyMaps panel. And this is a project I want to talk about that I worked on. It's one of many different MyMaps projects and projects we've been doing in Google Earth over the years in the Ethnographic Mapping Lab, which is based in the Anthropology Department at the University of Victoria. And this is in the west coast of Canada. And we have many collaborative projects with local Indigenous communities, including the Coast Salish peoples, who are First Nations community that live in and around the Salish Sea. So if you can imagine Seattle, Victoria, Vancouver, these are basically the territories of the Salish peoples. And I've been working here with these folks for at least 20, 25 years. And in this area, these are remarkable, vital Indigenous landscapes, really, really spectacular places that these Indigenous communities continue to hold a really deep cultural connection to. And there are all kinds of challenges that the Indigenous communities are facing around ongoing land and resource development. And since the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there are now opportunities and avenues for dialogue between the state and Indigenous peoples on how this development is going to go forward, and opportunities for trying to reach, to try to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and get the Indigenous peoples free, prior, informed consent in order for these important development projects to continue, if there are going to be any kind of impacts on Indigenous land rights or human rights, cultural practices, and so on. And so this is a significant challenge for many Indigenous governments that are engaged in all kinds of land and resource developments in their territories. And in the area that we're talking about here, these challenges are compounded by circumstances of history. So for instance, in this case, we have this map in MyMaps showing in blue line here where the territories of the Indigenous community are. And in the green line, a historic railway grant from 1884, which granted to, in fee simple, freehold title to nearly the entire southeast coast of Vancouver Island to a railway baron. And so now the Indigenous communities have these tiny, minuscule Indian reserves, they're called in Canada, where their houses are, where their schools and communities are, but they still have this large-scale connection to their territory, or they want to continue to assert their large-scale connection to their territory as a way to improve their socioeconomic conditions today. So there's a larger social and economic context for all this kind of work. So to our MyMaps project, we partnering with these communities, of the Hul'qumi'num peoples of the southeast corner of Vancouver Island. They are interested in drawing on all kinds of information to help them make decisions in their engagements with governments about what land and resource developments are going to happen. And they wanted to have an opportunity to compile information from a diversity of sources, share it between different tribal governments, all of whom have a connection to this overall territory. So there are 6 individual First Nations within this larger region. They wanted to be able to work with their partners. So for instance, the university where we're supporting the First Nations, or other organizations that they're drawing in. And they wanted to have a very straightforward threshold in terms of the ability to use the kinds of tools and data that were there. So that they didn't necessarily have GIS operator in every decision-making room. You know, they wanted this decision-making ability to reach a broad range of people with various levels of computer skill, if we want to put it that way. So we chose Google MyMaps as an opportunity to compile information on a large range of data sets that they can use to help inform those conversations. So one data set, as we saw this morning, was on deforestation. And certainly large-scale industrial clear-cutting is ongoing in the territories of the Halkomelem peoples. And so we ran an Earth Engine classification based by and large on the Matt Hansen data set and some other local data that we had. And we're able to map out the extensiveness of the deforestation in their territories. And then using the same kinds of tools that Rowley was talking about, Map Shaper in one instance and QGIS in another, we reduced the complexity of all polygons and brought it into an environment where through the MyMaps forestry concerns panel, you can look at deforestation, you can look at where the licensing and tenures are, and zoom in at quite a fine level throughout the territory. And it paints a pretty serious picture of the high level of deforestation that's happening here. Oil and gas, mining, oil and gas tenuring. This is all on private land, and so some of these records are actually fairly difficult to see, and there's a lot of barriers for people to actually go and physically view and access, much like the example that we saw in Brazil this morning, where people couldn't see these activities. So there's a lot of barriers for the Indigenous communities to actually visit parts of their territories with these no entry signs and gates over the roads and so on. And so we were able to pull in all kinds of data on this on mining, oil and gas development in the territories and show that through MyMaps. We were looking at urbanization. So again, we did another Earth Engine classification for a few different data sets of urbanization, one of which showed urbanization over time based on a classification of a fairly coarse classification of urban, agricultural, and forested lands, and another analysis based on light intensity. And that gave us a picture between 1999 and 2016 of the scope of urbanization in their territories. A major concern, maybe one of the most pressing and ongoing concerns, is the desecration of Indigenous burial sites. And these are places that have really caught the emotion and of a lot of the community members who are very upset by seeing their burial places and their ancestors whose remains are still there being excavated or bulldozed or destroyed by development. And so we were illustrating many cases of this that has happened so that we could help raise awareness in the broader community of this, including providing links in the MyMap, extensive links to different media articles about this, so that it wasn't just a one-off. This was 20 or 30 different instances of burial desecration that we were trying to reveal. The MyMaps allows us to put in major projects. For instance, these large pipeline crossings or major oil and gas infrastructure that's going in their territories, allowing them to visualize these things in relation to the other kinds of information. And I can go on. Marine concerns around the marine environment, concerns around the freshwater environment. We put together many, many, many different MyMaps on all of these different themes that the communities can then draw on in order to inform their decision making. And we also have built a website around it and a case study, which we're publishing some scholarly articles on to talk about the challenges that these Indigenous communities are having. So if you all want to jot down this URL or look at it later in the slide deck, you're welcome to explore these maps yourselves and see what's there. But in terms of the how-to, we were certainly spent a lot of time pouring through open data sources that were available to us, many of which were in government records, but also some kept by NGOs and some collected by the Indigenous communities themselves. And we pulled those into QGIS often and exported them as KML, or pulled them into Earth Pro and saved it as KML once it was within Earth Pro. And then we were able to import those shape files as KML into the MyMaps in order to see that. I have a little slide here about how we were able to pull the Google Earth Engine classification also into our project. And there's, if you follow the link along here, if you're interested in this, you can see a series of about 8 or 10 how-to slides of how we actually got the Earth Engine classification showing up in a MyMaps that you can go and then explore and look at what the results were. And then I think one of the final parts that I wanted to say about our project is in terms of how this information is being used by the community. One of the concerns I'm sure that Raleigh and many of you who have worked in Indigenous communities are fully aware of is that not all the kinds of data that Indigenous communities are collecting are able to be shared publicly. For instance, sacred site information, land use and occupancy data, those are often very private information that has legal and political consequences that First Nations and tribal governments keep very close to their chest. And in fact, many tribal governments are using Google Earth as the visualization tools for this private data, because the private data is sitting on their server in their office or on their local drive. They don't have to worry that it's in the cloud somewhere. And so we can use the network links in MyMap to visualize all this other data that we have in Google Earth alongside the local data that the First Nations have about their cultural landscapes. And that has helped over and over again in the evaluation process when there's going to be a threat from a new major project that's happening, or a new cut block that has been proposed by government that's then added into the table in the MyMaps. And they can visualize it absolutely immediately in their desktop in Google Earth. And indeed, they can take it out on their mobile device and see it in Earth mobile when they're on the fly. So again, because MyMaps is able to be shareable using these network links, it also is just a great way to de-silo all the different departments within the Indigenous governments and between Indigenous governments that are working together to provide a broader access to the information. So I'm really happy with this work. It's one of a number of projects that we're doing, but I think that this kind of partnership and project helps contribute to public education. I think like non-Indigenous visitors who are viewing our website and reading our scholarly articles about these land use conflicts are come to realize that, no, it's not just all private land, and this is a problem that ended back in the 1880s. This is something that Indigenous communities in the Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle area are continuing to face. And I think that by drawing attention to these issues and flagging them in the context of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we are helping promote the positive implementation of Indigenous and human rights. And I think. I don't know how into time.
Yeah, you're doing good. Okay. So, if there are any questions for Brian?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you collected the data which is not available in public, like conflict data, for example? Do you pick up some location of the conflict from the newspaper?
Yeah. That's a good question. So the ancestral site conflict data, this is interesting because the Indigenous government has the data on precisely where each of the burial sites were, but they didn't want us to reveal that information publicly. So they asked us to draw these enormous place marks, huge place marks at every place that you can't just like go to the center of and find out where the burial site is. They're randomized a little bit. And so, that's how we added that information here. Oftentimes, the confidential information is collected during field trips. Get on a boat, travel to the place, document it in your GPS, and we're building large data sets. We have data sets of thousands of points, 5,000 to 7,000 records of this kind of confidential.
So something like that.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, there's a project team that worked on this, including graduate student researchers at UVic and tribal employees in the Indigenous governments, and everybody signs in. It's just Google Drive like sharing, so everybody was able to contribute the parts that they were working on. Well, the real thing that drove MyMaps was the absolutely low threshold that for practically using it. Like 12-year-old can use MyMaps. It's very straightforward to use, and that low use barrier was the thing that that we really thought was the strongest. Google's engineers are maintaining the software. We don't have to worry about is it installed and working everywhere on each computer. We don't have to have a developer stressing over is the Carto database working and so on. Like those were the considerations in using MyMaps. All right, thank you so much.